My name is Michael, and I was born in 1939.
So our first question is, how fearful were people usually about the Cold War?
I think most of the just everyday people figured that it was so much out of their control that it wasn't all that much to worry about. The people in government talked a lot about it, and there were various times when the worry was more than others, but in general I don't think people were all that affected.
Okay. What was your earliest significant memory of the Cold War?
Seeing things on television, I guess, in the early 1950s, and hearing things on news broadcasts, and they always talked about the number of missiles that Russia had and that we had, and they said very quickly that if both sides fired all their rockets, they could kill everyone in the world 10 times over. There was that much firepower involved.
What were the roles like in society in 1950s?
Very different than today. Women were supposed to stay at home, have children, take care of the house. Men were supposed to go out to make enough money to support everybody at home. Children in general were supposed to keep their mouths shut, stay out of trouble, and go to school as far as their parents wanted them to, taking courses that their parents wanted them to take.
Were children allowed to go farther in education than their... Because I know that, so parents wanted their children to, they chose what their parents took, but if they wanted to go farther in education and their parents didn't want them to, or would they just not go farther in education?
Well, finances would be a problem. Mm-hmm. If they wanted to go further and they didn't win a scholarship and they had to work all the time, that would be something that would keep them from going to school. I know my father worked full-time at a steel mill and went to college during the nights, and he got a degree, but it took him like 6 or 7 years because he was only going at night. But frequently, if there was no money in the family, or very little money, the pressure would be on the children not to go to college, but just to go out and get a job, and frequently go out and get a job before they graduated from high school.
Civil rights. Sure. Did you or anyone you know get into the civil rights movement, and do you remember any media coverage?
Well, are we talking about the 50s or at any time?
Just general Cold War era, 50s to
Okay, in the 1950s, the civil rights movement hadn't started very much. It was mainly in the 60s where there were demonstrations and everything else. Actually, if it's of interest, during the 50s I went to one school in Pennsylvania and another in Wisconsin. As far as I remember, there wasn't a black student in either school. And in the neighborhoods that we lived, there were no blacks living there. So segregation and treatment of minorities seemed a long ways away from my life. And it wasn't something I thought about unless I saw something on the news. But again, in the 1950s, Eisenhower was president from 52 to 60, and he was known as a father figure, and business in the country was very prosperous. So there was no push by anyone to change the status quo, because most people, and I'm sure that the minorities weren't part of it, but most people were making a living and living well and doing what they wanted.
What was it like to be in the middle of the civil rights movement?
Well, again, in the 50s I wasn't in the middle of the civil rights movement. In the 60s was the civil rights movement, and I was mainly an observer in it, and watched all of the demonstrations on television and the violence, and heard about all of the killings that were a regular part of the civil rights movement then, but in terms of personal involvement, there was hardly any.
Any music that stood out as rebellious to you during 50s to 60s as part of like a cultural?
Well, Elvis Presley got started in the 50s, and he was banned in several areas of the country, and he was known as being subversive because of the way that he moved while he sang.
Did you listen to him?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and saw him on television, especially the Ed Sullivan Show, which you may have heard of or not, but yes, and I bought some 45 RPM records of his, and I don't really remember too many other, or any other artists really that were known as rebellious or antisocial or dangerous to listen to.
Did your parents like you listening to Elvis?
Parents didn't care. I guess, two things. They had enough on their minds with their own lives, and I imagine they felt that I was reasonable enough that, listening to some song wasn't going to change me radically. So,
How would you define the American dream?
almost impossible to achieve. I think the American dream involves security, which in this country at least means finances, and having those around you that you love and care for, and living in reasonably good circumstances, not in a slum, not near an industrial factory, but having a pleasant place to live and good company with those that love you, and enough finances to operate the whole thing. And as I said, I don't think that happens very often, because the fact that you're saying the American dream indicates a lack of worries or real worries, and I don't think anybody gets through adulthood without some, especially if they've got children. Children are always a major worry.
Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
That's it. You're welcome.